Hey guys. All right. We are back at it this week. This week we're going to be looking at chapter 12. Chapter 12 is going to be kind of an extension of chapter 11. Chapter 11, we talked about the Civil War, the war itself. And this all goes in a progression. Chapter 10 was talking about basically the causes of the Civil War, everything leading up to the Civil War in 1861. Chapter 11 was the Civil War itself. And now, chapter 12, we're kind of getting back into the progression after that of talking about what happens to the country as a result of the war. So, this chapter, we're looking at several different things. And for today, we're going to be looking at the immediate effects of the war. That last chapter, pretty much all that we did was that we got up to the end of the war, Lee surrendering to Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, the North Carolina campaign, which ended the war in the Western Theater. And by the way, there were also some other battles. I kind of ran out of time last time, but there were some other battles as well that actually went on. There were some battles in Missouri that went on past through the summer of 1865. Believe it or not, the Civil War even stretched to Texas and Arizona, even Hawaii. So just some side notes there that I ran out of time last time to get to. But for right now, we're going to be concentrating on the immediate effects of the war. And once Lee surrenders and the war is over, the Confederacy is officially surrendering. What happens next? So that's what we're going to be looking at this time around for today. First of all, the power of the government is going to increase as a result of the war. Now, one of the things that the Civil War does do in regards to long-term effect is that it leads to a growth of government. You know, back in first semester especially, when we talked about the creation of our country and the Constitution, one of the things that we talked about was that there was a big disagreement as to how big should the government be. And if you remember with the Articles of Confederation, the government was set up so that the states had the most power. Our founding fathers did not want to give a lot of power to the federal government. Keep in mind here that we had just come from the British Empire and King George III, who was pretty much an absolute monarch. And so our entire government and country was set up so that government would play a small role there to just protect us and there to just lay out pretty much the ground rules. It was really left up to the states to determine how each state was run. But we see several times in our history here to where the federal government gains more and more and more power. As you get into some of the Supreme Court cases in the early 1800s, Marbury v. Madison for one, then you begin to see where some legislation is beginning to change to where it gives our government more and more power. Well, the Civil War is one of those big points in our history that before the Civil War and after the Civil War, government gains more and more power. You have forced income taxes on the people of the country. So people are now are forced to pay income taxes, just like we do today. You had a paper currency for the first time. You're getting a national paper currency that you didn't have before. Keep in mind that before this, pretty much state banks and local banks issued their own paper money. Well, we've now gotten into throughout the war, we've gotten national U.S. currency. And so we're getting into the process phasing out the state and local bank money and having just a U.S. dollar bill. Now, those two things that I just talked about may not seem a big deal to us because it's just a normal part of our life. If we want to pay with something, then we have U.S. currency that we have to pay for. And we're all forced to pay income taxes as long as we work a job and those taxes are filed. But you want to talk about you didn't have either one of these beforehand. You've also had the draft that was put into place. Now, the draft has been there really ever since the American Revolution, but what was for the first time was used on a wide scale in the Civil War. This is really the first war to where the draft was really used on a large scale, to where you literally forced men to go fight. And so what we're getting here, and you add in the fact that that during the war, Lincoln suspends the right of habeas corpus, which is a legal term that was to stop newspapers from being able to print pro-Confederacy material. The whole freedom of speech and freedom of the press was pretty much suspended for the war. There were some constitutional legalities here that were being violated. And so when the war is over, the United States government has grown in power. They have gained more powers. Washington was no longer too far away to have an effect on individuals in other states. Washington, D.C. was set up as a city to where our national government could pretty much operate. It was a city isolated just for our government. And because of the lack of transportation in the year 1800, it was still a pretty long ways from anybody. But we've now gotten to a point to where transportation is increased because of steamboats and railroads. And as we get to the 1900s, you're going to have automobiles. And so the power of government has been increasing. Now, in regards to the idea of secession, again, was kind of out there since the very beginning of our country. South Carolina threatened to secede when Andrew Jackson had imposed tariffs or taxes. And it was secession that led to the Civil War. South Carolina seceded with the election of Abraham Lincoln. And over the next several weeks and months, you had 12 other states that seceded. So you get into the whole idea that now that the country is whole again, how do you handle the whole idea of secession, or rather the ability to claim yourself as an independent state? After the war, the federal government is going to take national supreme authority, which means that because of this rise in government, there are going to be things put in place to try to prevent any state from ever seceding again. And it hasn't. Ever since 1865, no state has ever seceded from the Union, which means that no state in the U.S. has ever broken off to become their own independent state. Now, that being said, it has been rumored from time to time since then. In the 150 plus years since the Civil War ended, there have been some states who have threatened to secede. There have been some territories that has threatened to secede from states, but it has not happened. Matter of fact, if I remember correctly, the last time that anybody seceded from the Union or from a state was West Virginia in the onset of the Civil War. So ever since the Civil War ended, no state has ever seceded or claimed their independence. And that's because of the increased power of the federal government. I'm going to put it this way. You guys are teenagers. Your parents, I'm not sure what your parents are like, but your parents want to have some strict rules for the most part to make sure that you guys are pretty much under control and grounded, to the point to where you make some good decisions and don't make mistakes that really messes you up. Okay, so there's a lot of control there to make sure that you stay in line, or at least I assume that to be the case. Same thing here. The federal government is like the parent to make sure that the kids don't get out of line again, or that the states don't get out of line again. There's going to be a lot of strict enforcements and guidance and governments to make sure that the kids don't get out of line, or that the states don't get out of line. And so that has led us into this new era of bigger government. The federal government is going to help business through the Civil War. So you have an increased role in government in regards to the economy as well. It leads to the construction of a national railroad going from east to west. You had the National Bank Act that was passed to give you a United States dollar bill, a national currency. And so as a result of this, Northern economy is going to boom. The federal government, for one of the first times in history, is doing a lot of what we call deficit spending to pretty much help the economy along. Something that we're seeing a lot of right now in our country. Because of the pandemic of the coronavirus, we've had these stimulus bills passed by Congress, and that is government intervention. Those are that's what's called deficit spending, because the government is spending a lot of money to try to keep businesses from failing and to try to keep Americans from going bankrupt. That's what's called deficit spending. That's exactly what you had during the Civil War, in that to fund the war and to make sure that the United States won the war to keep business going, the federal government spent a lot of money to support businesses and and things like that. And so the federal government is growing in power as a result of the war, and that power also includes power over the economy. The Northern economy is going to boom because of the making of war materials. Entrepreneurs are going to get rich by selling war supplies to the government. So you have factories that are going to pump out war materials. You have blacksmiths and guns makers and all these different artisans that are going to be making war materials. You have new types of weaponry You have the Gatling gun, which is the first type of an automatic weapon that's produced during the Civil War. Again, the Civil War brings us a lot of advancements in warfare. You go from fighting a traditional war in the beginning to fighting more of a guerrilla warfare by the end. The weapons themselves are going to be drastically increased in the 4 years of fighting in the war. And so you have a lot of these investors who are going to get rich during the war by selling war supplies. Well, after the war is over, they're going to take all that money that they made and they're going to invest it into new business. Now, you can say whatever you want to about CEOs and billionaires. However, history has shown us that when those billionaires and CEOs and rich guys take their money and they invest it into new business, then it provides jobs. It provides competition. That's really the glory of capitalism. And I want you guys to understand that. Give me just a minute or two to explain this. And that, yeah, you can talk about rich guys and CEOs and billionaires and all that kind of stuff all you want to, but in a lot of ways, that kind of stuff is important because the more money they make, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, they'll take that money and they'll invest it into new business, which means more jobs. It means more products, new products, technology. And so, in theory, it's supposed to give us a better economy. Well, that's exactly what's happening here during the Civil War. They're taking those, all that money, and they're investing it into new business. Things like new agricultural tools to bring you a large-scale commercial agriculture. So the northern economy is pretty much booming once the war is over. The southern economy is the exact opposite. The southern economy is going to be devastated. As we talk about this chapter, we talk about Reconstruction and the South trying to rebuild and pick up the pieces. The southern United States is going to have a very, very long and difficult road. It's going to take decades before the South fully rebuilds. And in some ways, the South never has fully rebuilt as compared to the North. So not only does the Confederacy lose the Civil War, but economically, the South is devastated. Again, slavery was wrong, always has been, always will be. However, when you look into the impact of agriculture in the South, again, the South was fully agriculture. That's pretty much what ran the economy. Now that slavery is over with because the 13th Amendment ended slavery, well, the cheap labor is taken away. And again, it is wrong, was wrong, and it should have been done away with a long time ago. But it brings about a new challenge for farmers who had slaves, in that now it cuts into your profits, or in some cases, any profit whatsoever. So you're having to rethink your strategy here, in that if you're a plantation owner, how are you going to hire people and yet make a decent profit? And now, again, you might be thinking, well, poor baby. Your slaves have been taken away, and so you're not making as much money as usual. And yeah, in some cases, that's the case. Okay, you got rich guys that are going to stay rich guys, but you have some people who might not be as economically lucky in regards to this might completely do them in regards to farm work. Now, again, slavery is wrong, should have been done away with. But there is an effect here on agriculture. 40% of the livestock in the South was destroyed during the war, as well as all kinds of machinery, railroads. You had a lot of transportation lines in the South that was destroyed. One of the important things in the Western theater was that as the United States came in and invaded Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, what happens is that a lot of those rail lines are destroyed, which means that once the war is over with, you have to rebuild those transportation lines for trade and for transportation. You have land that had not been cultivated in years, farmland that had to be recultivated. And for those of you who are not very familiar with this process, you can't just go into any open land and start a plantation. There is a lot of things you have to go into. So the Southern economy is really going to get in really, really bad shape. You want to talk about the Great Depression levels. That's going to be the South for many, many years. So the gap in between the Northern and Southern economies is going to continue to widen after the Civil War. So regionally speaking, this whole gap in between North and South is just going to continue to get wider and much, much more different after the Civil War. Matter of fact, I was reading an article a couple of days ago. It was Sunday night. after all the tornadoes, and you would not believe how many people in the comment section was making fun of the South and talking about this is talking about the tornadoes and this and that, and they were making fun. And what it came down to was that it was evident that there were still those regional differences in between Northerners and Southerners. And sadly enough, we're still at that point with a lot of people today. And so that's only going to get worse as we go further. Now, in regards to the cost of the war, in regards to human lives, 620,000 people died in the Civil War. 620,000 people died in the Civil War from both sides. You had 360,000 from the Union, 420,000 from the Confederacy. Now, believe it or not, most of those died from disease. It's hard to believe, and most Americans don't understand this, but most Americans that died in the Civil War did not die because of they were killed in the battlefield. They died from disease. They died from the harsh conditions, or they died from infections from battle wounds. 1 in 4 people that fought in the war never went home. So there's a 25% casualty rate here. And for some regiments, that casualty rate was much higher. In the 26th North Carolina Regiment, out of 800 men in that regiment, 714 died. In the 24th Michigan Regiment, that was at Gettysburg, out of 496 people, 362 died. In Pickett's charge, George Pickett, in part of his regiment, he had a group of men called the University Greys, which were men of the University of Ole Miss that had joined. And of those men, there were 135 of them. All of them died at Pickett's charge, all 135. Matter of fact, to put this into a little better context, in 1865, there were 139 men that were enrolled in the University of Mississippi. 135 of those died at Pickett's charge, so only 4 men were still left. So, on average, 25% casualty rate, but for some of these regiments, the casualty rate was much, much higher. There was another 476,000 that were wounded. 1 in 13 men that returned home had either missing limbs like hands or fingers or arms or legs, or maybe no limbs at all. Amputations. Another 400,000 were either missing or captured. So you're looking at over 1 million people here that either died, were severely wounded, or just flat out missing as a result of the war. Neither army was equipped to deal with the number of deaths that this thing was going to bring. Both sides spent a total of $3.3 billion on the war. So there's a lot of economic costs here as well. And when you talk about many of these men that joined the fight, then you're talking about men that once the war is over, they're going to get pension checks. They're going to get paid because they served as veterans. And so it's going to greatly affect the United States economy as well. Now, we do get 3 amendments to the Constitution. I'm going to try to wrap this up here in just about 2 or 3 minutes. But we get 3 different amendments to the Constitution that comes as a result of the Civil War. Again, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. The 13th Amendment did. The 13th Amendment was passed in January of 1865, and the 13th Amendment officially banned slavery in all states of the United States. So it was the 13th Amendment in 1865 that freed all the slaves. You get the 14th Amendment, which stated that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. shall be made citizens. So the 14th Amendment gives us the whole aspect of a natural-born citizen, and this specifically applies to those newly freed slaves. Anybody born in the U.S. is automatically a U.S. citizen and gets all of the rights and freedoms of the U.S. Constitution. And then the 15th Amendment basically said that nobody can be kept from voting because of race or color or previous condition of servitude. So because you now have slavery abolished, you now get the 14th and 15th Amendment saying that now all those newly freed slaves are automatically American citizens if they're born in the U.S., and that nobody can be kept from voting because of their color. And so what's called the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, is going to bring us into a new era because as a result of the end of slavery. Now, in regards to the post-war careers, what happens to some of the major leaders now that the war is over with? Well, for the Confederates, things don't look too good. Robert E. Lee, the commanding general of the Confederate Army, he lost his right to vote. Okay, because he was the leader of the Confederates, he lost his right to vote. He also lost his home. Robert E. Lee lived in Arlington, Virginia. Had a massive plantation, and during the war, his home is going to be turned into a Union station, and eventually into a cemetery. That cemetery is now called Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery was at one time the home of Robert E. Lee. So Robert E. Lee loses his right to vote. He loses his home. His homeland is now the largest cemetery in the United States. But he will serve as the president of Washington College in Virginia until the time of his death. Ulysses Grant, the commander of the United States Army, is going to stay in that position for the next few years and will be elected president of the United States in 1868. And we'll talk more about Grant's presidency over the next little while. William Tecumseh Sherman remains in the Army. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, is going to be arrested and charged for treason. The president of the Confederacy will be put in jail for 2 years. And after those 2 years, he will be pardoned and spends the rest of his life selling life insurance in Memphis, Tennessee. You will talk about going downhill very quickly. Jefferson Davis was a U.S. senator before the war. He was the president of the Confederacy, and then ends up selling life insurance. Now, nothing against selling life insurance, but things for Jefferson Davis just never goes back to the same. So the final piece there is that for many of the Confederates, you have to start over a brand new life. Many of your rights are taken away, the right to vote. Eventually, all the Confederates will be pardoned of all the charges, but that takes some getting used to on down the road as we go through Reconstruction. Next time around, we'll talk about what happens with President Lincoln after the war.